Ah, polygamy. That is the opening scene of a TV show called Big Love, which is about a Mormon family practicing polygamy under the radar and living in Utah. It's a really interesting TV show. It's fiction, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend you check it out. But I will say the way that it portrays modern polygamy feels like a very far cry from the polygamy of my ancestors, which I'm going to jump into today. I feel like modern polygamy is often compared to basically modern non-monogamy. It's posed almost as this free love kind of thing where anything is okay between consenting adults. Today's video is going to get into the history of my literal polygamous ancestors, which is crazy. However, I think it's definitely worth investigating if polygamy in the early church is like Big Love or if it's more like this.
Young girls were like a commodity owned by the church.
Warren had himself 78 wives. 24 of those wives were underage.
We're going to go after the criminals, and we're going to go after the child abusers.
That was the trailer for the docuseries Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey, and it covers the rise of Warren Jeffs as the leader of the FLDS. As you've heard, 24 of his wives were underage, and I feel like the comparison between my ancestors and the FLDS is much more accurate than the comparison between my polygamist ancestors and Big Love. This topic of polygamy always felt somewhat distant from me. Even though I grew up Mormon, I grew up learning about Joseph Smith, it always just felt like almost like this very long ago thing that had no bearing on me and my life. Before we start, just a reminder to like this video, subscribe to my channel, please drop a comment if you have any thoughts while you watch the video. This video will be about my family history in polygamy. Next week's video will be part 2 and we'll pick up where we left off after Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, and we'll cover his polygamy very specifically. My channel does contain a lot of negative information about the Mormon Church, and when I first started making this content, I decided I wanted to make sure that my personal information wasn't out there for anyone to be able to find and see. When I went digging, I realized just how much of my personal information was online, and it honestly really freaked me out. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and really anyone who might want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, relatives, it is all out there. That's why I've been using Aura, which is the sponsor of today's video. Aura is amazing because it shows me which data brokers are selling my information. It also saves me a ton of time because it automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my information not only helps me reduce the amount of spam I get, but it also protects me from hackers who could use this information to get into my social media account, bank accounts, or other information. Recently, AT&T revealed that over 73 million customer records of both existing and former customers were released on the dark web. They recommended those affected use strong passwords, monitor account activity, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts from credit bureaus. The great thing is, Aura does this for me. And the best of all, I don't have to download several different apps just because one company couldn't keep my data secure. Aura keeps me from worrying about things like the AT&T data breach. Aura is always on and doing the hard work to keep my data safe. I value my privacy and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/Alyssa Grenfell to get a 2-week free trial. Growing up, I was a proud Mormon, and I would tell most people I would meet that I was a member of the church. I would always carry my handy dandy Book of Mormon. I'd always write a testimony in it. And so most people, a lot of people I would say, knew as a kid that I was Mormon before they would even know my name. People would definitely make jokes about me having more than one mom, which I would laugh off, and I would say, you know, we don't practice polygamy. That was a really long time ago. Maybe it was like 3 people. People would also ask me very sincerely if I had ancestors who were polygamist. And what's funny is, I knew quite a bit about my family history in the church, but until I started researching for this video, I never actually checked to see if I have polygamy in my direct family line, which is kind of crazy. When people would ask, you know, do you have ancestors who practiced polygamy? I would typically say, probably, you know, it's probably hiding somewhere back there, but I could not answer specifically if that was the case or not. Not only do I have polygamy, I have multiple generations of polygamy. I'm going to share every crazy thing I learned about about my literal DNA in this video. And I'll also preface this video by saying I will be sharing about the first cousin marriage that I am directly related to. I did learn a bit about my family history from my mom growing up. We never talked about polygamy specifically, but I did learn about my ancestors and grew up with just a ton of pride about how far back my lineage in the church goes. Growing up, I always viewed my ancestors, specifically through my mom's side, as being very faithful. They came across in handcarts. We learned about the stories of them crossing the plains. It was always posed as this family history to be incredibly proud of, that I was basically linked in with some of the most noble and ultra faithful members of the church that have ever lived. My family history in the church goes back 6 generations. So that is 6 generations of a chain, a strong Mormon chain of link after link being very active and faithful within the church. Prior to my first ancestor joining the church, this same lineage goes all the way back to the Mayflower. So I have ancestors who I am directly linked to who crossed on the Mayflower to settle in the United States. So it's not just, just like with Mormonism itself, it's not just the religious aspect. It is the pride in the level to which you are an American, the level to which my ancestors, I learned growing up, came here for religious freedom. They came here because they wanted this opportunity for this beautiful new world. And I think growing up, I really had instilled in me, on the 4th of July, we would talk about my pioneer ancestors and my Mayflower connection. And a lot of pride growing up came from this American lineage that my parents instilled in me. And so when I left the church, all that was remaining were these memories of me growing up and hearing these faithful pioneer stories that my mom and dad would tell me growing up. When my husband and I left the church when we were about 23, we decided to move to New York City. We moved to Brooklyn, New York. And I think a lot of that, I think a lot of the motivation to do that came from a desire to just almost completely turn my back on everything I had known. I wanted to live in a different place. I wanted to wear different clothing. I wanted to find new people. I wanted to be in a place where a lot of people might not even know what a Mormon is. And even if they generally know what it is, they've definitely never met one. And so I think when I first left, I just wanted to completely turn my back on my faith, on my cultural community, on my heritage. I just wanted out. And it was like I essentially closed my eyes and put my past, both my literal past and my genetic past, in a black box and threw it at the bottom of the ocean and said, that has no bearing on who I am now. Also, when I left, I removed my name from the records of the church. So this is essentially like excommunicating yourself. And it means you say, you reject your baptism, you reject your temple endowment, but it also means because you literally have your records removed, I no longer have a membership number. And the church has a very big family history database, which I talk about why that is in my Baptisms for the Dead video, which you can go watch if you're curious. But I used to be able to access this family history. But as soon as I removed my records from the church, it meant I got removed from my ability to access this family history database. So after I left, I actually couldn't, even if I had wanted to initially, I couldn't research this stuff easily because I couldn't see my literal family history. I also didn't want to ask my family, especially recently, because now they know this channel exists. And unfortunately, I know if I go asking questions like, was my great-great-grandpa a polygamist? It no longer sounds the same as when I was an active member. So I felt like finding this information became really difficult. And for a long time, I didn't even really know where to start because I didn't want to ask my family, and I no longer had access to the database that I would have had access to had I not removed my records. I started to have a ton more questions, almost like revisiting this black box I had thrown back into the ocean, wanting to go scuba diving and get it back up again and ask these questions that are about my literal family. I think when I revisited all this information about Joseph Smith, and as I've been studying, I've wanted to figure out, how does my family fit into this absolutely wild puzzle that is Mormonism? I was reflecting on this, and obviously I remembered that my longest standing Mormon relative was through my mom's line. I also remembered that when I was a kid, I went to Porterville, which is the line that my family goes back through, is through the last name Porter, and that we went to a family reunion in Porterville, and there were tons of Porters around, and that I realized was my nugget for figuring out how my family fits into Mormonism, even if I didn't have access to the information I would have had through FamilySearch.org. I remember that there was this old church building. That was my most distinct memory from this family reunion. So I just looked up Porterville on Wikipedia. This was 2 days ago. So I literally didn't know any of this until 2 days ago. I initially was going to make this a TikTok video or a YouTube short, and then I realized there's so much here that I wanted to make a whole video about it, because my family history with Joseph Smith, with polygamy, with the Porter line was just kind of like a little mini brain explosion when I was researching this. And I even thought to myself, this YouTube channel was all fun and games until I started reading this information. It really hit me like a ton of rocks, because I'm no longer just thinking about Joseph Smith, who almost seems like he was never a real person, just this phantom in American history. But now we're making it so it's literally about my great-great-great-grandpa. Porterville was founded by Sanford and Nancy Porter. They are my first relatives to have joined the Mormon Church, and they joined in Ohio in 1831, which was 1 year after the Book of Mormon was published. After doing a lot of this research, I did ultimately end up texting a family member because I wanted to know if this was my real relative, which was confirmed. So even though initially when I was reading all of this, I wasn't sure if this was my relative, I now have confirmed proof and evidence that this was my relative, and Sanford was the first member of my lineage to join the Mormon Church. With a bit of Googling, I found a 71-page document, which I'll link below, that goes over Sanford and Nancy and their conversion into the church and how they went from Ohio all the way to Utah to found Porterville. Sanford was apparently personally acquainted with Joseph Smith, and he heard him preach, and they talked together. As we jump into this information and get into some of the aspects of my family history about polygamy specifically, Mormon history is a really difficult thing to learn about because it is all written by faithful members of the church. So it's a real history is written by the victor situation, where the most easily accessible information, at least for me, is all coming from faithful members. And so it's really difficult to figure out and find some of the sources of the people who were disenfranchised from this religion, because what's been kept sacred and held and written down and passed through generation to generation is the record from the active members. For example, Joseph Smith in his own journal was actively denying that he was practicing polygamy, even though we have many records from the women he married that they were all in polygamous relationships, so much so that historians definitively agree that Joseph Smith had more than 30 wives. But if all we had was Joseph Smith's journal, we would say he only had one wife. So keep that in mind as I share this information. I try to read between the lines and look into specifically some of the wives we'll discuss, but ultimately, I don't have access to these people's real lives. I don't have some Facebook I can go stalk. It's just the records that I can find easily that are public access. Sanford, like I said, was converted in 1831. He also, in his record, shares experiences of being visited by personages and having angels visit him and tell him before meeting Joseph Smith that he shouldn't join any church, but he should wait. In Sanford's journal, he said that he asked the spirit, very similar to Joseph Smith. This is written after the fact. This is him reflecting on his life later after joining the church. But his story is that he asked the personage, are there any churches or denominations on the earth that I should join? The angel said, no, none of them is right. Jesus Christ organized his church with apostles who were prophets, and then they declared the things that would come to the earth. They spoke of a time when the church of God would come to the earth again, which time is shortly ripe. So basically, before learning of Joseph Smith, Sanford said that an angel told him to not join any of the churches, but he should wait till he finds a church, sounds like, with apostles and prophets. 1831, Sanford was met by 2 missionaries, which was very common. As soon as, even prior to the church being fully organized, there were already missionaries for Joseph Smith going out, knocking on doors, just as the modern church does today. From his account, 2 elders came to their town, which was in Ohio. Those elders were Lyman Wright and John Corrill. Sanford said that he went to their meetings and that he didn't immediately want to get baptized, but as he was pondering one morning, he heard a voice that said, "This is right, arise and be baptized." And with this one man who joined the church and had a voice tell him, "Arise and be baptized," he made it so that the next 6+ generations of his family would sing praise to the man who communed with Jehovah about Joseph Smith, who would serve missions themselves, go door to door, knocking and inviting others to be baptized. And it's kind of crazy that that's how families work, that one person happening upon Mormon missionaries meant that I, over 100 years later, would also be a member of this church. In the last couple days, just binge reading about Sanford and his children and his wives, I just keep thinking about the butterfly effect, how, this one man flaps his little butterfly wings and joins the church, and then as a result, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people end up becoming associated, especially because they all have so many kids. As Sanford was joining the church, the Saints were in the process of moving from Ohio to go to Independence, Missouri. So once he joined, he sold his farm. Him and his wife, him and Nancy, sold their farm, and they got in their little wagon and they headed to Independence to join the Saints. Now, I knew growing up that the Mormons got kicked out of everywhere they went, and they suffered a ton of religious persecution. And this was always posed to me very much as Joseph Smith was such a righteous prophet, and he was speaking so much truth that his prophecies, even just the fact that he taught that God, the Holy Ghost, and Jesus Christ were 3 separate beings, that his teachings are the reason why the Mormons receive so much religious persecution. That is the narrative I was spoon-fed since I was a little kid, that Joseph Smith was so righteous and that there were evil men who were basically possessed by Satan, who were trying to keep the saints from founding Zion and trying to keep the church from being restored. The reason that history gives that Joseph Smith took the Saints from Ohio to Missouri involves him being in trouble with the law. He had a failed bank, and that he was there was a warrant out for his arrest, and that he decided to go across state lines to run from the law, and then encouraged and got the Saints to follow him to Missouri. I never knew that growing up. And it's also not clear what's wild is what's also not clear is that the saints themselves understood that that is why they were moving. Joseph Smith settles down in Independence, Missouri, and immediately declares it the place that Jesus Christ will come again. He calls it Adam-on-Diamond, and it's not just where Jesus Christ will come again, it's also the location of where the Garden of Eden was on planet Earth. And so the saints have this, I assume, from what I can tell of Sanford's records, that they had been called to Missouri to settle Zion in this beautiful and prophetic vision Joseph Smith had, and that they were following this man of God in his prophecies. However, if you just look at what history says happened, Joseph Smith got in trouble with the law. He needed to run away from the warrant that was out for his arrest, so he crossed state lines and found his new home in Independence, Missouri, which is where he told the saints to gather. Those are very different narratives, both of which can kind of simultaneously be true. The kind of average everyday believer doesn't seem to understand what is happening with the leadership and what is happening with Joseph Smith. So there's two narratives here that we can follow. One is my relative Sanford, who seems to be a farmer who has a faith in Joseph Smith, that Joseph Smith is restoring God's church. And the other narrative is Joseph Smith, the leader himself. At this point, Independence, Missouri was on the absolute western edge of the United States. I have been on vacation to Adam-on-Diamond, Independence, Missouri. I've also been to vacation to Nauvoo. And so these places are still very much held sacred by the church. The church owns a ton of land in these places. When Joseph Smith arrives, he claims that Independence, Missouri is the New Jerusalem, so that's where they're going to settle Zion, the site of the Garden of Eden, the construction site of Noah's Ark, and where the second coming of Christ would occur. Sanford and his wife follow Joseph Smith. They begin to live the law of consecration. The law of consecration is essentially communism. Basically, every single one of the saints who joined was asked to sell everything they owned, give all of their money to the church, every last cent, all of any earnings, any of their livestock, whatever, and in return, they would receive back a parcel of land that they could begin to farm and participate within the Mormon community. The law of consecration is still taught to this day in Mormon temples, where essentially you say that everything you have, your money, your talents, everything you have is dedicated to the LDS church. And that's one of the promises you make during the endowment ceremony in Mormon temples. In Missouri, the saints unfortunately continue to get into trouble, mostly because of their leaders and not because of the average everyday saint. I always learned that when they moved to Missouri, that the people there didn't like them because, like I already said, their religion was peculiar, their beliefs were not in line with traditional Christianity, and so they had a hard time. If we look at the other side of the coin, though, we see that there's a religious leader with a very cult-like following who has crossed state lines to avoid getting in trouble with the law. Estimates put it at maybe 5,000 to 10,000 saints who came to Missouri, came to Independence, and they declare this land that it's Zion. They declare it for themselves, essentially, as God's chosen people. So if you consider a small town and suddenly a ton of religious zealots are coming, their leader is a criminal fleeing the law, and they're declaring that your town is actually theirs and it's meant to be given to them by God, that might cause some unrest. The primary worries early on seem to be that the members of the church would take their land and also vote for their own politicians, their own members as politicians in the state and in the county, instead of those who had already been living there over time. keeping in mind, of course, that those that were living there had already stolen this land from Native Americans. And so we see that there's just this continuous mad grab for land and power and authority in this early time of settling the United States. Even after the Saints are in independence, they get pushed out to far west Missouri and then again to Caldwell County. So essentially everywhere they're trying to go, people are essentially pushing them out and saying, we don't want you here. Another aspect of this dislike towards the Mormons, I think, was definitely Joseph Smith's desire for political power. So not only is he a criminal fleeing the law, he is setting him, and he's not just a religious leader either, he is consistently setting himself up to be a political leader as well. After Missouri, when the Saints go to Illinois, they start their very own town and they declare Joseph Smith not just prophet, but mayor as well. And then later on, he begins to say he's going to run for president of the entire United States. And so this religious aspect of the Mormon Church is ultimately not just about a faith or a religious belief. It is about a grab for political power too, with Joseph Smith, but also later with Brigham Young being the mayor of Salt Lake City. So Mormonism has always been deeply tied, not just with religious belief, but with a desire for political power as well. As the Saints are moving from place to place, some of the top leaders of the church are threatened and excommunicated and ousted from Joseph Smith's inner circle. One of these is Oliver Cowdery, which if you watch my video about the story of Joseph Smith early on, Oliver Cowdery is one of the 3 witnesses in the Book of Mormon. He's also one of the people who helped translate the Book of Mormon. So Oliver Cowdery is essential to the story of the early church. He was scribe. He was one of the 3 witnesses. But a breaking point for Oliver Cowdery was polygamy. So as they're in Missouri, Joseph Smith becomes involved with a 16-year-old girl named Fanny Alger. Oliver Cowdery said that this was a dirty, nasty, filthy affair of Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger's. And so essentially Oliver Cowdery hears about polygamy, hears about this affair with Fanny Alger, doesn't condone it. He says, this isn't spiritual polygamy, this is just an affair. You're already married, and I don't stand by this. And as a result, Oliver Cowdery and a few others that felt like him are kicked out of Joseph Smith's inner circle. And during the time in Missouri, there start to be splinter groups already forming outside of Joseph Smith's church. One of these is the Danites, who became somewhat violent, and it's unclear if the Danites and their violence was encouraged by Joseph Smith or condoned, or if it was something that was done outside of his kind of permission as the leader. In 1838, tensions between the Mormons and the people living in Missouri reached a boiling point. The Danites apparently planned to burn down Richmond and Liberty. They had also apparently invaded Davis County and sacked the county chair of Galatian. When the government of Missouri hears of this plan to burn Richmond and Liberty to the ground, the military gets involved. This amounts to what is known as the Battle of Crooked River, which I'll put a link to the Wikipedia page below. Essentially, during the initial skirmish, both sides say the other side fired first. There are several deaths. 3 members of the Mormon Church die. 1 member of the military dies. And at this point, the Mormons are fully taking up arms against their government. This can be taken one of 2 ways, though. One is that they're taking up arms for protection because the military is now out to get them and they are persecuted. The other perspective is that they are essentially some kind of insurgent group that is operating outside of the government and are saying, we listen to our prophet, we don't listen to the government of the United States. It very much reminds me, and I highly recommend it, the TV show of Waco, which is based in Texas. The story of Waco happened much more recently in 1993. Essentially, the story of Waco is that the Branch Davidians were holed up in their religious compound. The government came and tried to get their guns from them. It became this standoff between between the government and the people of the Branch Davidians, which ultimately ended in a lot of deaths, most of them women and children. And so just as in the story of Waco, we see the same with the Mormons and the people of Missouri, where neither really seems like they are in the right here. I definitely think if there is a battle between two factions that ends in the death of children, obviously something went wrong. And so just like how the Branch Davidians and their battle with the government ended in children dying, the same is true for the Mormons. So after the Battle of Crooked River, there is the events at Hans Mill, which is essentially where another militia group from the government, unclear if they were fully sanctioned by the government, comes to Hans Mill. The women and children, most of the women and children run into the trees. A lot of the men try to take up a stronghold in this cabin, but the cabin has slots through the logs, basically. And so when the militia fires in, the events at Hans Mill end up leading to the death of 18 different members of the church. Some of those were children, the youngest of which was 7 years old. The Wikipedia page for this event is very gory. When one of the members of the militia was asked to justify why he killed the child, he said, "Nits will make lice, and if he had lived, he would have become a Mormon." It is interesting to me, just in the same way that if you go to the Book of Mormon's Wikipedia page, it says the neutrality of this article is disputed. If you go to the Hans Mill Massacre Wikipedia page, it also says the neutrality of this article is disputed. I did know about Hans Mill a bit growing up. There is a TV show, a movie called Legacy, and in Legacy, they do portray the story of Hans Mill. Let's watch a clip. Obviously, it's very wrong that children died, that innocent men died. And I think it's very interesting that they chose to tell the story of Legacy, through the eyes of a woman. They show this scene through the eyes of the child that you see in the beginning. I can't think of a more sympathetic way to depict these events than showing them through the eyes of the child. And I feel that the reason I find this depiction shown in Legacy frustrating, two reasons, is that it shows the parts that make my history, my Mormon history, the most sympathetic, which is that like I've been saying, that they were persecuted for their religion. And that is definitely true. I mean, he's killing the little boy because he is Mormon, because he will grow up to become a Mormon. That, to me, rings only of religious persecution. But it ignores the fact that the leader of the church was doing things like polygamy, like trying to get political power, that people were saying is wrong and that people were upset about. And so it's very frustrating to see these two parallel narratives, one of which are farmers who are trying to follow their Christian religion that they found restored in Joseph Smith, and who seem, in many cases, to just be poor farmers without a lot of education and who are just really sincere. And then, on the other side, to see a religious leader who is manipulative and conniving and ultimately constantly in trouble with the law, who is getting his people into situations like this. Are these boys, these men, these children, these families, are they in trouble with the militia because of something they did or because of something their leader did? And ultimately, I think the blame for Hans Mill and for these deaths should not be placed on just the government, on Governor Boggs, but also should be placed on Joseph Smith for creating this dangerous setting and leading his people into this situation, which obviously was rife with issues from the beginning. Just as we see in Waco, just as we see in Warren Jeffs, that the leaders make choices that lead to the deaths and the estrangement and the injury of their followers are the ones who end up really taking the blow for the leader's teachings and choices. I think too, the frustration for me as an ex-member comes from the lack of honesty. Hans Mill obviously did happen. Everyone agrees on it. Those men were buried in a mass grave at the bottom of a well. That is horrible. But be honest with the rest of the history too. Don't just show me the pieces that are going to galvanize me the most against anyone that is not members, the government, that just makes me feel like I will be persecuted religiously for being Mormon. Show me all the times Joseph Smith got in trouble with the law. Show me 16-year-old Fanny Alger. Show me all the other wives too. That is why I feel frustrated, because they show me Hans Mill. My heart bleeds. Of course it does. But show me the other things too. Tell me the truth. Do not, and this is the story of the entirety of how the church poses its history, do not just show me whatever version is the most faith promoting. That is manipulative. And that is why a lot of people leave now that we have internet access. You might have noticed we lost Sanford for a bit because I needed to give you that context. So Sanford is still faithful. He's still in Missouri. From what he says, basically they had settled far enough away from all of this that they really weren't in the thick of it. There's no history of him being in this battle. In his writings, he doesn't seem to perceive anything other than the religious persecution they're experiencing. He doesn't seem to note that the saints have done anything to warrant this level of hate, and that is, he's getting the same information I did, which is that the saints are perfect and pure, and they're beautiful, and they're wonderful, lovely little Christian families, and that for whatever reason, Satan is attacking them through the government, through the militia, and through mobs. Before we keep going, just a reminder to like this video, subscribe to my channel. Next week's video is part 2, all about Joseph Smith's polygamy. If you're in the process of leaving the church and you're finding that leaving the Mormon church is not as easy as it seems, I suggest checking out my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church, an ex-Mormon's guide to rebuilding after religion. I worked on this for about 2 years, and I recommend checking it out. It also has a lot of my own personal stories about me leaving, so if you're just curious to learn more about my story, you can check that out as well. The link will be in the description. After Governor Boggs issues the extermination order, the saints flee again. This time they moved to Illinois, and they found their own town called Nauvoo. They also call the land across the river Zarahemla, which is a name from the Book of Mormon. My ancestors, Sanford and Nancy, settle in Zarahemla, so they're basically continuing to follow Joseph Smith as faithful members. By this point, it's likely that Joseph Smith had 3 wives, so polygamy is already implemented. A lot of his early leaders, a lot of the people in his inner circle have already left him over polygamy. Sanford is now 50 years old, and while they're in Nauvoo, 2 of their children die. Sarah dies 1 year after she was married. Apparently, she wanted to marry someone who said they would convert to the Mormon church. After they're married, he does not convert, and the record that I found basically says that she died of a broken heart, that he would not convert 1 year after their marriage. So what? I mean, now if you have a broken heart, you probably just download Tinder, but that I wasn't really able to find a lot of information as to why she died a year later. It's probably just of sickness or malnutrition. Their 13-year-old, Nancy and Sanford's 13-year-old, also died in a farming accident. So now them moving across the country with Joseph has amounted to the deaths of 2 of their children. I can't imagine what that would be like. I think, if I look at it from his testimony, Sanford's testimony of what happened, he's taking this basically to be that God is trying them. Satan is trying to keep Zion from being founded. But I, as a parent myself, I cannot imagine choosing to follow a religious leader from place to place to place, constantly selling your farm, buying a new farm, and then to realize, basically that this choice you've made has already amounted to the death of 2 of your children. While the saints are in Nauvoo, the Nauvoo temple is built. After it's built, Nancy and Sanford get baptized for the dead for all of their family members they can think of. If you want to learn more about baptisms for the dead, you can definitely watch my video about that. I'll link it below. They are also endowed. They receive the temple endowment. I'll get in next week into what that looked like in the early days. Now the temple endowment is where you wear clothing that looks like this. You make promises with God. I already mentioned the law of consecration, and I have a video about that as well. Nancy and Sanford are also sealed in their temple wedding for time and all eternity. So it seems that once the temple is built, they already start doing all of these ceremonies that Joseph Smith seems to have more or less invented, or he say was revealed to him by God. While this is all happening, Nathan, Sanford's son, is out campaigning for Joseph Smith to be president when Joseph Smith, at this point in 1844, is shot and killed while imprisoned. He was imprisoned for burning down the printing press that someone was trying to start, an ex-member was trying to start to oust him for his polygamist practices. And basically, Joseph Smith chose to try to burn it down. He got in trouble with the law for this action, this arson, and as he was imprisoned, he is shot and killed along with his brother Hiram. At this point, after the death of Joseph Smith, a lot of people thought this would lead to the dissolution of the church. I think there were so many members at that point and so much to be had, so much power to be grabbed. They had a whole town, they had thousands of members, lots of land, lots of people, lots of polygamy going on, that there was a mad grab for power. A lot of factions come out of this death of Joseph Smith since there was not a clear successor. Brigham Young is one of these men who stands up and basically says, I'm meant to be the new prophet. According to the story of Brigham Young, apparently at one of these meetings when they were trying to decide who would be the next prophet, Brigham Young took on the appearance in a miraculous event. Brigham Young started to look just like Joseph Smith as he spoke, and everybody, accepted Brigham Young. A lot of people, the majority of people, accepted Brigham Young as their new prophet. In the account of my family history, it says a few continue to have their doubts, creating splinter groups which plague the church for some time. I thought that term "sometime" was funny because lots of splinter groups exist to this day. One is the FLDS, one is Community of Christ. So there's a lot of factions that exist to this day, and they have not just plagued the church for some time, it's definitely ongoing. As a result of these factions, one of my ancestors, Sanford's daughter, chose to follow one of the splinter groups, which went to Texas. Basically, Sanford is one of the first to go in these wagon trains trekking out west. Salt Lake is found and founded, and then the saints slowly but surely come in these different parties, wagon parties. Many die on the way to go to Salt Lake. At this point, this is Mexico territory, so now they are completely removed from the United States federal government. They are basically just going into uncharted territory, putting down a stake and saying, this is the place, this is where we're going to live, and hopefully we can continue to practice our religion, practice polygamy, practice whatever we want, because now nobody's watching us, and really the only people they had to deal with are the Native Americans, which they have many battles with and pretty effectively, as many white people have done for a very long time, get the Native Americans to leave through threats, through violence, and they found their new Mormon city in the mountains. Once the saints are in Utah, polygamy is in full force because, as I said, they no longer have any non-Mormon neighbors with prying eyes, gossiping about them, saying that they're breaking the law. So polygamy in Utah really breaks out in full force at this point. And this is where polygamy hits into my own family history. One of the defenses of polygamy is that at a certain point before Brigham Young took the saints to Utah, he committed some of the Mormons to go fight in the Mexican-American War, kind of as a symbol of trust in the government and to get the government off their backs a little bit by building goodwill. The defense for polygamy is that during this Mexican-American War, many of the Mormon men died, leaving their wives, husbandless, and that the members, the faithful men who lived, needed to take care of them. They needed to seal them with them in the temple, so they had eternal companions. They needed someone to take care of them. That is the defense I most commonly heard growing up. Actually, it turns out that only about 20 members of the church died during the Mexican-American War. Some were injured, definitely, but not like half the men died or anything like that. The defense given by the writer of this document about my ancestors says one of the effects of the Mormon Reformation was an increase in plural marriages, especially among men who held leadership positions. Since exaltation in God's kingdom could be assured only through temple ordinances, men were encouraged to be sealed to women whose situations left them vulnerable. So this word vulnerable is very interesting and feels like it harkens back to what I was taught about women who had their husbands die in war and were destitute and had mouths to feed. So, but when you dig into it, the word vulnerable does not actually mean quite what you might think it does. So Sanford, my ancestor, was then sealed to a woman called Phoebe Emmett, who was the former wife of a family's old friend, James Emmett. So you might think that based on the word vulnerable, maybe James Emmett died in a battle or died of dysentery or something. What really happened is that Emmett refused to accept Brigham Young's authority and was disfellowshipped from the church. So because this man would not recognize that Brigham Young was the next prophet, apparently, he was disfellowshipped. So he did not die. His wife was not left vulnerable by the fact that he lost a limb. He was disfellowshipped, which means that spiritually he no longer is endowed. He no longer has promises to become a king in the afterlife. He essentially is spiritually excommunicated, so which means his wife is left vulnerable, not financially necessarily, not with so many mouths to feed with no one to care for them, but because her husband is disfellowshipped, she essentially is given to my relative Sanford as a way for her to receive the saving ordinances and still be sealed in the temple. James Emmett had already been a faithful member for quite a long time. Like I said, it was a family friend, and we don't get to see his side of the story. Essentially, all we see is that he's disfellowshipped, his wife is left vulnerable, and that she is then remarried to Sanford, and that is how he gets his first plural wife. If we look at it from James's perspective, though, he didn't want to follow Brigham Young. He didn't recognize Brigham Young's authority. And as a result, he's kicked out of the community, which happens in polygamy today. If you don't support the leaders, especially as a man, you're kicked out of the community, and the wife is gifted or transfers over to a leader who is still righteous. So there is definitely an incentive for men who are in leadership to stay as yes men to the leader, because they are gifted brides who have their men sent away if they're not righteous enough. So there is definitely in polygamy an incentive to send away as many men as possible, because it makes the ratio more favorable for the leaders to have more wives. The record says that Emmett forced his oldest daughter, Lucinda, to accompany him to California. Apparently, Lucinda, they're making it out like the dad, took her and carried her out of the house and said, "You have to come with me." If I read between the lines, basically Sanford's son, Sanford Jr., wanted to marry Lucinda. Sanford refused to disavow polygamy. And so the dad did not condone the marriage and basically took Lucinda away. So he's being made out to be the bad guy for not letting his daughter marry someone who wouldn't disavow polygamy. It does say when Lucinda cried over losing her love, James beat her with a whip. So at least with this accounting, James is very much the bad guy. He sounds like an abusive father. But this is an account written by a faithful member. So we really have to question what actually happened, because anyone who walks away from the faith, like me, is ultimately led away by the devil. They're lazy. They are child abusers. Like he's being called, he's saying he beat her with a whip, how evil he is. How, though, can we really know if he truly was an evil father if the account is only written by the faithful who view him ultimately as the enemy? Lucinda makes her way back to Utah and marries a man named Armstead, and Phoebe ultimately goes and lives with Lucinda and Armstead. If you dig into the story of Armstead, he actually married two of Phoebe's daughters, Mary Jane and Lucinda, and so we see that she goes to live with the sister wives, which are now under Armstead's domain as his two sister wives. It definitely seems, looking at this union, basically like Phoebe married into Sanford's family, and then several of her children ended up marrying Sanford's children. So basically, mom is sealed to dad, and then their children all start marrying as well. Sanford and Nancy end up with their sons building a sawmill, and they settle along this Canyon Creek area with their sons and their families. Sanford builds the first home in what will become named Porterville, which I have been to for my family reunion, and this happens in 1860. Nancy dies. After Nancy's death, Phoebe comes back to live with Sanford for a while. It's not really clear how much they ended up in total living with each other, but as I said, Nancy was buried with Sanford, and Phoebe was buried with her biological children, who were sister wives with Armstead. Sanford died at the ripe old age of 83, having converted to the church in Ohio, moved to Missouri, moved to Illinois, and then later died in Utah. Let's talk about his kids, which is my next generation of ancestors. So this would be my 5th generation back. Sanford had 9 sons, and I am directly related to 2 of them, which you might ask, how are you directly related to 2 of his sons? It's because they had their children get married to each other. Their two first cousins are wed in union to each other. This marriage happened in 1874, and this was my great-great-grandpa and grandma who were first cousins from these polygamist marriages. I did not know that I had a first cousin marriage in that direct of a family line till 2 days ago when I was researching for this. My family member was kind enough to screenshot and send me this family tree, which I'll include here. It's a little blurry because, like I said, it's a screenshot that I was sent. But essentially, my great-great-grandma and grandpa I saw both have the same last name, Porter. Usually in Family Search, the woman always goes by her maiden name. So they're both under Porter. So I look up and I see that Chauncey Warren Porter and Lyman Wright Porter had their polygamous marriages and had children, and then those children got married to each other. So that is I did not know this. A very clear record of a first cousin marriage 4 generations ago, which really doesn't feel that long ago, and has made me wonder if that's why I've always struggled with spelling a little bit. We'll first look at my relative named Chauncey Porter. Chauncey would have been my great-great-great three greats grandpa, and he had 3 wives. Family Search only lists him as having 2 wives, but later in other documents he has 3 wives. His first wife, Amy, had 8 children. And I'm going to read from this accounting from his second wife, Lydia. Essentially, Chauncey had his first wife, Amy. With their family, they left Independence, Missouri for Nauvoo. So they're caught up in this, that's Sanford's son. So Sanford's son, Chauncey, he gets married. They're all headed to Nauvoo. They're all faithful members of the church. It says, after traveling about 100 miles, Chauncey decided to return to Missouri for the grain and livestock he had left. On his way back, this is crazy. On his way back to his family, he saw 14-year-old Lydia Ann Cook tied to a tree. Being a soft-hearted man, he untied her and took her back with him. They take Lydia in when she's 14. That's when he finds her tied to a tree. It sounds to me like she was an orphan, that she had been left tied to a tree to die by her family or by someone. It's unclear who left her tied to the tree. Chauncey takes her in at 14. She becomes one of the older daughters. She refers to herself as his daughter. Amy, his first wife, grows sick and apparently dies. But before she dies, she asks if Lydia will become Chauncey's second wife. And so at 16, after being taken in by this family as the daughter, at 16, Lydia Ann Cook was married to Chauncey Porter, a man 18 years older than her, by Brigham Young at winter quarters. Later, a few years later, Chauncey marries a third wife who is the same age as Lydia. In the accounting from Lydia, she tells this story with quite a bit of joy and happiness. It's very difficult for me, living here in 2024, to see anything other than total tragedy in this woman's life. She's an orphan. She's left to die by being tied to a tree, which sounds so nonsensical and confusing, but apparently that's how it worked back then. And then at 16 is asked to marry this man. Later, Lydia writes, she did her best each day to ease the sorrow that was in all their hearts and care for and teach the children of Amy, and found that she did love the man who had befriended her and had given her a good home. So what do we read into that? And found that she did love the man who had befriended her and given her a good home. Lydia is my great-great-great-grandma. So my great-great-great-grandma was tied to a tree, left to die, befriended and taken under the wing of a Mormon family fleeing to Utah. When the first wife dies, she then marries the man who saved her from the tree at 16 years old, when he was 18 years older than her. The youngest of the children she would be asked to care for as their new mother was a 12-year-old boy. So she is asked at 16 to be the mom to a 12-year-old and to be the wife of a man who is 18 years older than her. I don't know what must have been like to be Lydia. I don't know how we can really look at this woman and see anything other than tragedy, as I said, because she had so few options in life. And obviously, if this were to happen today, if a family adopted a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old who became 16, and the mom died, certainly if the daddy then married the adopted daughter, that would be illegal. That would not be okay. But when you read Lydia's writing, she writes of it all with such almost gratitude, happiness, resignation. It's very difficult to read between the lines of a woman from the 1800s who was once tied to a tree. Lydia goes on to bear Chauncey 14 children. Amy, his first wife, gave him 8 children, and Priscilla, the third wife, gave him 12 children. So that brings Chauncey to having 34 different children by 3 different wives. As I was clicking through some of the different memories related to Chauncey, I found it pretty funny and interesting that there is no picture of Chauncey, and if you zoom in, it says that he never had his picture taken. He thought it vanity. So he was, he had 34 children, but he was too vain to have his picture taken, but he definitely spread his DNA everywhere. Looking at the other side of the first cousin marriage, we have Lyman Porter and Electa Mariah Kilbourne. Lyman had 2 wives. Electa he married when he was 19 and she was 17, and his second wife was Sarah. Sarah had 3 children, and now we see Emmett come back up in Lyman Porter's second wife, Sarah. So as I kind of said earlier, once Phoebe and Sanford got together, their children started intermingling. We see here that Lyman ended up marrying Sarah Emmett as his second wife. So it's all very much whether through literal blood relation getting married or just familial, non-blood related marriage within the family. There's a lot of that happening during this time. It also feels like there were so many children. I mean, currently in the FLDS community, oftentimes, if you watch Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, the children are very much treated as communal children within the families. So some of the moms know who the children are, but sometimes if the mother is transferred to a different husband, or in the case of Warren Jeff, some of the children were just sent away to be in Texas, away from Utah as the new Zion. When there's polygamy, when there's this many wives and this many children, some of the children or some of the wives, everyone's getting swapped out. And so the lineage, I think, probably is somewhat difficult to figure out. I'll also say a lot of them have such similar names. So if there's a man with 3 wives, each of the wives will name one of the kids Joseph after Joseph Smith, or Hiram, or name them after the son or after the dad. So if a dad has 3 wives and the wives are maybe trying to get in closer with the husband, they might name one of the first sons after the dad. So the dad then will have 3 Chauncey Juniors or 3 Sanford Juniors. And that also, I think, adds to the level of complexity and difficulty of figuring out these familial lines, because they're all intermingled. There's cousins marrying cousins. There's sister wives having children with the same man. They're all naming them after Book of Mormon characters, after the dads, after Joseph Smith, after church leaders. So it's just, wow, trying to figure out how all these pieces fit together is remarkably difficult. One thing that is interesting about Chauncey and Lyman is that Chauncey is the oldest brother to have come from Sanford, and Lyman is the youngest brother to have come from Sanford. So Chauncey and Lydia, the girl that was tied to the tree, they have a son named Justin Porter. Lyman and Electa have a daughter named Mary Porter, and those 2 Porters, those first cousins, are married, and that is my great-great-grandparents. It's funny to see this in the family tree picture, because it's like the family tree undulates. Usually it just grows. In my case, it undulates because the cousins come back to marry each other. And honestly, in reflecting on all of this, I can't believe I didn't know this. I'm 31 years old, and I come from a religion that loves family history. I come from a family that taught me about my beautiful pioneer ancestry. I never knew that I had first cousins married to each other as my great-great-grandparents. And I also, I never thought that I would find myself Googling, when did it become taboo to marry your first cousin? Because, this was still the 1800s. I've got to wonder, how much did they know about genetics? The marriage of these first cousins took place in 1874. So from what I can tell in my research, and I would love if someone has a little bit more information to comment below, it wasn't yet taboo, but this was around the time it was becoming taboo. In some communities, it was more taboo than others. Not marrying your first cousin was discouraged long before the 1870s, but it's unclear the level to which within the United States it was taboo and within Utah. I mean, it obviously seems, in all my research about Mary Porter and Justin Porter as the first cousins couple, I'm not able to even find any evidence or writing that they found this to be peculiar. It probably, it might just be because nobody was going to talk about it. It might be because it wasn't strange or considered odd yet. For most of these couples, which I've been linking, screenshotting the photos, there is a typed out life story of the different couples. When I went to go read the life story of Justin and Mary Mariah Porter, the two cousins that got married, I was not able to find within their life story any evidence to hint at the fact that they were cousins that were marrying each other. When they are talking about their union, it just sounds, just like two people getting married in a small town. Even just the fact that they mention it's a small town called Porterville, I suppose that's the only hint at the fact that the small town might not have had a lot of options for marriage outside of all of these polygamous families that maybe you were going to be related to somehow. Mary and Justin had 7 children together, and that was Justin's only marriage. So it is interesting to see how polygamy works in my family history, because I see, so Sanford had Phoebe, that he had 2 wives. Phoebe didn't bear him any children though. She already had children, and they didn't marry till she was in her late 40s and he was in his late 70s. So Sanford is a polygamist with only children coming from one wife. Then him and Nancy have their kids. Chauncey and Lyman are 2 of those kids. Chauncey has 3 wives. Lyman has 2 wives. All of their wives bear them children and are concurrent living marriages, true, full polygamy. Then after Chauncey and Lyman, polygamy, at least in my direct grandparents, dies out. So Justin has a large family with Mary, his cousin, 7 children, but he does not have 2 wives, he's not living polygamy directly. And I found this very interesting because their marriage was in 1874. Polygamy was not outlawed in the church till the 1890s. So I was, at first when I was researching this, naive woman that I am thinking, maybe it just became less accepted. Maybe it became more taboo. 1874, that's still 15 years before it's outlawed in Utah, but maybe in Porterville, they were like, hey, let's not do this anymore because polygamy, do we need to be marrying 14-year-olds? Maybe we should consider. So I when I first was looking at this, I really started to think maybe they just stopped practicing it in my family. But oh, naive little Alyssa. The reality is that if you go and look at my female relatives through this Sanford Porter line, the female relatives are still in polygamous marriages. It's just the men that aren't being given more than one wife. So what this means is that essentially my family line seems to have fallen into not being in leadership anymore. The men were no longer leaders, but they're still faithful. So the men are given only one wife, but the women are still married into the higher leadership as polygamist wives. And that's how polygamy in the Mormon Church has always worked. Same with the FLDS. The prophets and the leaders of the church have many wives. Brigham Young had 50 plus, Joseph Smith had 30 plus, but the underlings have very few wives. So if you're middle management of the Mormon Church, maybe you'll get 2 wives, maybe 3 wives. Chauncey was Sanford's oldest son. He had 3 wives. So it seems that Chauncey was potentially the most affluent of the Porters to come from Sanford. But by the time we're reaching down into the 3rd generation to come from Sanford, we're no longer seeing polygamy for the men because the men are no longer in high enough leadership positions to garner them polygamy. But if we go and look at the women, we see the women still being married through the 1870s. We still see the women of my family being married into polygamy because polygamy is alive and well. They didn't stop practicing it because they became enlightened. The men in my family stopped practicing polygamy because they no longer were in leadership. Oh, part of me is like, should I be talking about this on the internet? I mean, you know, I'm not the smartest person. I don't necessarily like to believe I'm, you know, impacted by inbreeding, but I guess I'll leave that to you to judge. I will say that when I was a teacher at the MTC, I got into this fight with a Mormon missionary that I was teaching, preparing, you know, I was the teacher, and he said that polygamy only ended because the government made us give it up, and then it was still an eternal principle. That's why it's still in the scriptures. And I remember arguing with him and bringing up the fact that Gordon B. Hinckley went on Larry King Live and essentially said that we don't believe in polygamy and it's a messed up practice. Let me play you a clip.
First, tell me about the church and polygamy. When it started, it allowed it?
When our people came west, they permitted it on a restricted scale.
You could have a certain amount of...
The figures that I have are between 2% and 5% of our people were involved in it.
To fact check Gordon B. Hinckley, it says at most 20 to 30% of Mormons would practice polygamy. Another study said between 15 and 30%. So, and keeping in mind that only men could have wives, so 30% of the populace practicing polygamy is a far cry higher than the very small percentage Gordon B. Hinckley mentions in the interview.
It was a very limited practice, carefully safeguarded. In 1890, that practice was discontinued. The president of the church, the man who occupied the position which I occupy today.
So 1890, he's giving the 1890 date. Even though the prophet did proclaim they're going to be done with polygamy, it's not like he stopped doing it himself. He continued doing polygamy. The next prophet also was a polygamist and kept his wives. So this is a little misleading as well.
You condemn it?
I condemn it, yes, as a practice because I think it is not doctrinal, it is not legal, and this church takes the position that we will abide by the law.
I condemn it because it is not doctrinal. It is in a book of scripture called the Doctrine and Covenants. Still, Joseph Smith's taught polygamy is part of eternal salvation. I find it to be quite disturbing that, and this is what the elder in the MTC said to me, right? He said, he's not speaking from the pulpit of the church. He's not speaking at General Conference. He's not speaking as a prophet. He's speaking as a PR man to a man on a night show. And I, growing up, heard this and felt so much peace knowing a prophet of the church said, we're not going to do polygamy anymore. It's not good. Polygamy is bad. He condemned it. But the truth of the matter is, polygamy is still in Mormon scripture. It's part of what Joseph Smith taught. It's part of what Brigham Young taught. Prophets for decades taught polygamy was part of salvation. And I find it remarkably disingenuous going back to this clip and watching it and looking at my entire family history in the which polygamy is left and right and does not seem to be just 2%, that Gordon B. Hinckley went on Larry King Live to say these things when they're just patently false. They are misleading, and they're just not in line with true Mormon history. I want to believe Gordon B. Hinckley had a tender heart that night, and he is just coming to this with, the desire to be a servant for the Lord. But to me, watching this again as an adult and as an ex-Mormon, knowing more about my own family history and church history, I see this as nothing other than a man saying the right things on a TV show that would be viewed by many, many different non-members. And he's putting the best PR foot forward for his organization. I think in processing all of this, family history, in processing polygamy, in processing early church history and everything that happened that's part of my DNA, I have several different thoughts. The first is I definitely think of myself and I think of what my ancestors would have thought of me. Here I am, not being married to sister wives and one husband. Here I am only with 2 children, not 14. Here I am with a nose ring, showing my shoulders and bashing the church for the whole world to see. And I, in the past, have felt very sad thinking about these ancestors who, were in many ways just part of a system, in many ways seem to have been just doing the best that they could with the information they had. They didn't have access to Joseph Smith's criminal record. They didn't have access to the dark sides of church history. They seemed to just be poor farmers who were religious converts to something they believed in, and that they believed in it so strongly that they followed through till the ends of the earth. And so I waffle back and forth between the idea that my relatives, my ancestors, would hate me and find me offensive and would say, oh, you are so evil, you're possessed by the devil. Or maybe they would look at me and say, hey, in the same way we ardently pursued truth at any cost, you are doing the same. And if we had the information you now have, we wouldn't have done the things we did. I think that's why I feel so dedicated to this channel, or even telling this story, which is a little embarrassing all to admit and kind of wild and crazy to me, is that I feel that people deserve education. People deserve to have access to as many resources as possible so that they can make an informed choice with their life. And sometimes I think in my most optimistic point of view that my ancestors would meet me and give me a hug. And that they would say, hey, we're really proud of you, because if we had access to this information, we would have made different choices too. Or the women, if the women had access to an education and money and the ability to vote and the ability to divorce, if they had access to all of these things and could do them as easily as the men seem to be able to, maybe they also would have made different choices. It also makes me think a lot about the fact that life is so short. All of these people living living these crazy lives that can be boiled down to, these life stories, they're 2 pages. They're 4 paragraphs. And if you go further back in time, we have even less records of people. And so as much as life in this moment, I'm worried about X, Y, and Z. I'm thinking about my 5-year-old going to kindergarten, and I'm worried about what will happen next year. Just how my life someday will be condensed to a 3-paragraph obituary. And the only people who will remember me are the people closest to me that love me, like my children and my spouse and my future, maybe, hopefully, grandchildren. While some people might say, oh, losing the idea of forever families, that sounds so sad, that sounds so dark. I find the fact that we only have this life to be really empowering and really beautiful, and I don't want to waste it. And I don't want to just spend my time scrolling on my phone late at night. I want to connect with the people around me. And I find it to be really empowering, the fact that I'm not waiting for some mansion in heaven. I'm not motivated by fear out of going to anything but less than the celestial kingdom. I feel empowered by the reality that is this moment, that I am staring at this black circle of a lens, and I am trying to connect with you as you watch me and find the information that I've shared today interesting for whatever reason that might be. I find that to be really beautiful. I also think it's crazy that some of the people who will click on this are descendants of Sanford Porter and Nancy Porter. Some of the people who will find this video, inevitably, because they had so many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, someone who finds this will literally be my relative, will be my third cousin. We're not going to get married. I promise. I'm already married. And so if you are, connected to me in any way, please drop a comment, unless, I'm embarrassing to you for the ex-Mormon reason, the cousins reason. But I hope this video does find its way to someone who's related to me. That would be cool. Or at the very least, finds its way towards someone who finds this information helpful in making a choice for their life. And just a reminder, if you haven't already, please like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to learn more about church history, about Mormon culture, and drop a comment if anything stood out to you or you have any information to share. I want to close the video with this final scene from Legacy, the Mormon movie about the pioneers. I grew up watching this video, like I said, and this is what she wants me to remember about my pioneer ancestors.
And make sure that this legacy of faith may never die.
And so, to my ancestors, I'm very sorry that the buck stops with me. I'll see you all next week.